Greetings, everybody. Today I bounced off the walls a little bit with some E3 poison in the rapid game that I played. And I wanted to, make this a fairly light video, but just wanted to sort of walk through some key moments of the game and discuss an opening idea. So you notice I have this skull and crossbones over the E3 pawn. And the reason why is going back, I decided to play an opening known as E3 poison. And why don't I try to clear that? Okay. And what is this all about? So after these opening moves, if I want to play kind of a really standard, direct classical opening, I can play knight c3. And the idea is that if black plays bishop g7, angling for, say, a king's Indian defense, I can play e4 and gain a pretty strong central presence here. And this is a good way to play, of course. But black also has the option after knight to c3 to flip the script a little bit and play d5. And this rather disruptive move is known as the Gruenfeld defense. And the main idea is that I'm able to take the pawn, they take back, and I am granted a two-pawn center, which feels great, but black does get something in return, which is trading the knights here on c3 and playing the move bishop to g7. And here, black's idea is to put a lot of pressure on d4. The c5 pawn break is in the air, and these lines are very, very sharp and complex. So definitely an opening worth exploring, but also an opening that is very demanding and very concrete for both sides. And so the move knight f3 is keeping, my options open. So if black tries to play d5 immediately, I'm happy to take. And the big difference here is if the knight recaptures, there's no knight c3 available. So after e4, you're not really able to compromise my structure, like in the Gruenfeld, where this pawn is backward and can be a subject to attack. So by playing knight f3, I'm kind of bypassing the Gruenfeld for now. And after bishop to g7, now I play a little move, a poisonous move, you may say. There's a book called E3 Poison by Grandmaster Axel Smith, where I first saw the idea, and you can play the move E3. And this is a rather modest setup, one that, you're not trying to rule the world or instantly win the game or anything like that. But what you're saying is, I'm not going to let you comfortably play a Gruenfeld, because if you play D5, again, I can take you, you take back, and there's no knight here in order to compromise my structure. So I can just play E4, hit the knight, and have a healthy two-pawn center. So it's kind of an interesting anti-Gruenfeld idea, and just a way to play chess and not to have to memorize tons of variations. So here, my opponent castled. I played bishop e2. Notice I'm not playing the move knight to c3 yet. I can, nothing wrong with the move, of course, but here we return to Gruenfeld waters because after takes and takes, now the knight is able to create that friction with its rival there on c3. So I don't want to do that. I play bishop e2, and I'm basically waiting for my opponent to play the next move, which is d6. And now that the pawn is committed to d6, rather than waiting to, go into a Gruenfeld, now I bring out my other knight. So that's kind of the basic idea of the opening. And here, pretty common for black is to play knight bd7 and go for e5. A very interesting line. For those of you who may play the French defense, you might find a similarity in how black, or should I say white, is playing. Basically, if I, flip the board for a moment, let's set up a position like this. There is the King's Indian attack, where you can play the move knight d2, and I'm just going to make some random moves, nothing overly critical, but just kind of wanted to point out that here you can bring out your knight, and notice I have kind of that E3 poison vibe going on as black. So I'm someone who does like to play the French, and so here it's kind of like playing me flip the board again, like a reverse French up a tempo. So very interesting line. And here my opponent didn't play knight bd7 and e5, but played knight to c6. Very similar to moving out the knight, preparing e5, but one positive to the move, it keeps the diagonal open for the bishop. But a big drawback is I can actually push forward now and attack the knight. So here, if black kind of insists on moving forward, knight e5 is kind of an instructive error, because here I would happily trade knights, and then I would play the move e4. And this is a really good line for white because the bishop is completely blocked by the pawn there on e5. So by playing e4, we're keeping the bishop hemmed in, and it's not going to breathe any traditional kind of dragon fire down the long diagonal anytime soon. As long as I can keep a pawn here and keep it blockaded, that bishop is not too active. Meanwhile, I'm also observing the other diagonal the bishop might try to consider. So d5 is a critical choice, and my opponent basically, I think the thread of this game is spent too much time developing, undeveloping, and never quite getting fully ready for the middle game. So after the knight moved back to b8, I play e4. Reinforcing my center. Black played e6. And here, there's nothing wrong with castling, but I decided to take a different route, and I captured the pawn. And my basic idea here is that if the bishop takes on e6, I would probably play knight to d4, centralize my knight, put a little pressure on the bishop here, and I feel pretty solid. My pawns have a very nice light squared grip, and, we're just playing a game of chess here. But in the game, my opponent captured with the f-pawn. And so on one hand, it's a big success for the rook, perhaps, to enjoy open lines down the f-file. No, there's no longer a black pawn blocking its way. But on the other hand, this pawn becomes a bit of a target, and it also blocks the bishop there. And notice by sort of luring the pawn to the center, it's no longer defending this pawn. So the only pawn that's able to defend it is the h7 pawn. So if it ever moves forward, then that pawn might become a target as well. So I'm not doing anything like particularly special in this game, but I am looking for small advantages, trying to accumulate a little advantage here, a little advantage there. And over time, I hope that I will gain something concrete in return. So I continue to accelerate my development, and I'm feeling pretty good. My opponent here, I think, makes a really critical error. Here, if you're black, you're already behind in development, and you moved your knight here once. Feels maybe a little weird to return it back to that square, but truth be told, it's a very active square. If allowed, you'll play e5 to help fight for the dark squares and open up your light squared bishop. And this would have been, I think, a more favorable option for black to keep the game more complicated. Here, black said, I want to get d5 in, but I don't like seeing 1, 2, 3 defenders against 1, 2, 3, 4 attackers on that d5 square. So why don't I prepare d5 by playing c6? So now if my opponent has another move, they'll probably play d5. And that way they're trying to break up my light squared bind there in the center. And so here I decided, just to spend a moment and say, okay, what does my opponent want? They're going to push this pawn forward, okay? I don't really want to let them break in the center like that. But what is the drawback to this move? It blocks the knight, fine, that's certainly a drawback. But did the pawn have a job one move ago? It's a very common error to push a pawn forward and not necessarily reflect upon what it was doing, a move ago. In other words, it's guarding its friend here on d6. So once the pawn moves here, all of a sudden, I don't love, from black's perspective, that pawn is hanging out, even for just a move, right? That it's not guarded by any pawn, but only by the queen. That makes that pawn and the square a little bit tender. And here I played a disruptive move, e5. And the idea is that, if you take, I'll probably trade queens here. And when black takes back, I could even take the pawn if I want. And at the end of the day, it's not like white's winning by force or anything like that. But black's pieces are all, kind of blocked. I mean, this rook is active. I, should be fair to that rook. But, the queen side is feeling rather sluggish, but also structurally, I have 2 pawn islands, right, where pawns are connected here and here, whereas black has 3 pawn islands. That's 1 island. Here's an isolated pawn island, and then here. So 3 pawn islands, and that's going to be something I can target in the long run. Now that they're, white doesn't have a pawn on the e-file, that might be something in the long run that I'll target, that e-pawn with my rook or a rook, for example. So I like the e5. I like the timing of it. And it's the kind of move you can find when you think about what does your opponent want, d5. Is there a drawback to their last move, especially a pawn move? Yeah, that square and that pawn's a little tender. Let's play e5 and maybe even restrict the bishop a little bit. So my opponent moved the knight back. Here I played bishop g5, attacking the queen. And my opponent decided to move here. If they move to b6, by the way, attacking the pawn, my thinking was I would first throw in, do I need to react? Like my pawn is under fire, but before I react, maybe I would throw in this move, attack the rook. And if the rook moves to, say f5, now I can defend my pawn and play the move knight a4. I attack the queen. I have 1, 2, 3 attackers against that weakness, and this is not looking very good for black. So instead, my opponent moved the queen here to keep a close eye on e7, and now, give black one more move. Maybe they're going to maybe not play that, but d5, and so I captured to kind of break up that plan, and here my opponent captured with the knight. Here, from white's perspective, the opening has gone well. My pieces are developing, they're talking to one another, and my structure is doing, overall pretty well. And here I played the move queen d2. And this is kind of a good illustration where it feels like white is really harmonizing here, right? The queen and the bishop are talking, the knights are well placed, the bishop is backed up, or the bishop, I should say, is backing up the knight, and now the rooks are connected. So I'm almost completing development here, and it feels like I'm about to play the middle game before black has completed the opening, meaning these 2 minor pieces are, slumbering, and it's not really obvious how to get them all into play. So I played queen d2, and here my opponent played knight f5, and I just play a simple move. Time to activate a rook. Which rook should I develop to d1? Again, using that idea, ask the other rook. Both rooks, I think, could find a life here, and I don't think they would object if the other rook took that role. But I did play rook a d1 specifically because I was happy to have this queen-rook battery control the open d file, but also I wanted the rook to keep a careful eye on f2. If I move my other rook here, then the only thing guarding f2 is my king, and I just want to be careful to avoid any accidents that could somehow happen on that f2 pawn. It doesn't look like it will anytime soon, but it didn't feel necessary to move a rook that I think had an important role. Keep the king safe, keep everything really solid, and meanwhile, I'm fully developed, for the most part, while black is still, struggling to complete the opening. So here, my opponent played the move h6. And again, another pawn move. The pawn attacks the bishop, sure, but what did it leave behind? So now we start to see 3 pawns that cannot be defended by any other pawn where they stand. So here I see 3 targets, and this pawn is now undefended. So I think my opponent was probably surprised by my next move. Maybe a strange looking move, but basically, you know, if I move back, they can play e5. And I wasn't so sure about allowing that. And if I move here or here, then I get captured potentially by the knight. One of the reasons I was, really quick to develop and take advantage of this open D file is now I have 1, 2, 3 pieces all pointing at D8, and black only has 2 defenders. So I think my opponent might have been a little bit surprised to see bishop D8 show up on the board. So I moved my bishop to a rather interesting square, threatening the queen and enjoying protection from the queen and the rook. And it allows my bishop to sort of live to tell the tale. Rather than being traded by the knight, I keep the bishop on the board and I keep the game complicated. Now, it is possible for my opponent to play something like queen to d7 and offer a trade of queens. Nothing wrong with accepting the offer, by the way. But if they play here, I have no shortage of moves where I can move my queen to safety and discover the rook's attack against the queen and also protect the bishop there. So I wasn't overly worried about that choice. It was interesting, but my opponent ultimately decided to play queen to f7 here. And I have to admit, when I played this weird looking bishop d8, I didn't have like some grand plan set up in my mind. But once my opponent played queen to f7, I did start to think about the bishop kind of bouncing off the walls like billiard balls here, going off of the corners and rerouting in a very interesting manner. And so here I played the move knight e4. And my basic idea is to centralize the knight, eye some important dark squares, but also clear the c3 square for my bishop. In other words, if I could just kind of dream for a moment, I would love to take these 2 pieces off the board potentially, because when you play an opening where you've pushed a lot of pawns around your king, you're kind of relying upon the pieces to shield your king. And with this fianchetto structure, the dark squared bishop is a really important defender as well as attacker. So if I could get rid of these 2 pieces, I would feel okay. And so my idea is if my opponent played something like knight bd7, I bounced off of, one wall. Now I'll bounce off another corner with the idea of bouncing to the c3 square and offering a trade of bishops perhaps. And this was kind of in my head while my opponent was thinking, but that didn't quite turn out the way I imagined because black played knight d4. And I have to admit, this move surprised me quite a bit, and it shouldn't have. And what I mean by it shouldn't have surprised me is that if you are, squeezing your opponent and you're taking advantage of this open D file, right? I'm really relying on long distance protection between the queen rook and the endangered bishop there on d8. So basically any of these squares, black could interfere with the communication between the queen rook and the bishop. So definitely something to be alert for, that the greater the distance between you're defending pieces with like a vulnerable piece, the more likely there could be opportunities for your opponent to kind of interfere with your connection. So knight d4 was a surprise. Completely missed this move. But at the end of the day, I was able to kind of resurface. And, I think this is a really important lesson is that when your opponent plays a move that surprises you, it's really easy to allow that to kind of just hijack your narrative and be like, oh, there's a knight here, everything's crazy, I better zoom in and react. But truth be told, that is exactly what my opponent wanted. They wanted me to kind of zoom in here and allow the rook to take the bishop. And all of a sudden, my knight is pinned, the bishop is enjoying not having a rival on the dark squares, and this is not what I wanted. So a very, very creative idea by my opponent, but unfortunately for them, I don't have to react. And here I just go back shooting the billiard balls around the board, and I bounced off of one corner, and now I go here. And in the long run, I was thinking about returning to c3, like I was mentioning, to trade bishops, but that didn't quite happen in the game because knight takes bishop occurred. I captured the knight, and now e5. So black is trying to open up the game, try to get that bishop into play. And rather than attacking the pawn, which I thought about, by the way, adding a second attacker there, I thought, hang on a second. That rook is really short on squares, right? It can't move here, not only because of my bishop, but also the rook. So if I attack that rook, it only has one square, which is actually in forking distance with the queen of a knight. And so sure enough, I was able to find bishop to b4. I attack the rook moves to e8. Then I would happily play knight to d6. And here I'm forking the queen and the rook. But I have to admit, I hallucinated a little bit in the game. I was a little bit worried that they could play queen to e7 and pin my knight to the bishop. But that was rather silly because, number one, I can just take the rook, period. And worst case scenario, I'm giving up bishop for a rook, which is what I wanted to do anyway when I attacked the rook. But the other point is I'm also ready to take that fianchettoed bishop, and that would make the king really exposed here. So at the end of the day, I just documented a moment where I completely overlooked, kind of a refutation to what I was worried about, that this pin is really absolutely nothing. So during the game, I was visualizing, maybe I could play bishop a3. But in reality, no, not at all. Just take the rook. I wasn't tested with that line. My opponent decided to kind of go all in here with bishop g4. And so they're hoping to create some kind of weakness and dream about attacking my king, but I don't mind. I'm going to take that rook. And here, my opponent takes back with the bishop. And now that the opponent is moving backwards, I move forward. Rook d8, I pin the bishop to the king. I pin the undeveloped knight to the undeveloped rook. And things are really feeling bad for black. After knight d7, my opponent just gave up the rook, and things just fell apart quite quickly. But there's really not that much black can do. Queen e7 I thought about during the game. And, there's a funny idea. I could play rook e8. I thought about that during the game to attack the pawn. And if they take back, there is a fork. But in reality, I think I would have played rook fd1 and just kind of stay solid here. And it's just kind of a visual example, if black is still not finished with development, I'm up material here, and things are not feeling very well. I'm taking advantage and controlling the only fully open line on the board, so this one went well for black. And the game finished rather quickly with knight to d7. I captured the rook. They played this move. I captured, and now that pressure against the pinned knight is relieved by just simply moving the queen to e5, taking a pawn, offering a trade of queens. Here, black just sort of collapses, takes my knight, I take the queen, and resigns. So overall, a very interesting game. I used an opening concept that doesn't require a lot of memorization. It's just kind of a concept of like, okay, discourage the Gruenfeld and just play a very modest opening and just play chess, and it worked pretty well. Now, my opponent didn't play as actively as they could have. I mentioned here in e5, but when your opponent moves forward and they're threatening something active, question that aggression a little bit and be like, well, hang on a minute. Why can't I just, challenge that knight? And sure enough, I did. And that gained a lot of time, a lot of space here. And ultimately, the big concept I want to share is bishops bouncing off of walls. This idea of bishop g5, what a journey this bishop was ready to take in the game. And this disruptive pawn move, e5, was able to create some weaknesses. And after queen d2, I was able to develop quickly. And here my opponent, I think, missed bishop to d8, a very disruptive move, but just that visual impression, right? Here to here, bouncing off the walls, would have been a very interesting way to try to grind down my opponent. But the crisis occurred earlier after they played this surprising knight d4. The problem is, once I kind of saw through the tactic, black is continuing to move pieces developed several times in the game already. Meanwhile, there's 3 pieces that really haven't done anything. So I'm able to really take advantage of that lead in development. And at the end of the day, the dark squared bishop, you wouldn't think, on move 4, this piece is going to do much, but it became the MVP quite quickly in the game after I was able to attack the rook, and basically things fell apart from here after rook d8. So anyway, a little bit longer than I intended, but hopefully an interesting game, and one in which you can, explore some ideas that you might not see every day. You're not going to necessarily see a bishop on d8 and then bouncing off the walls like it did, but a really interesting concept, and overall a nice game to share. So thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.